Good morning. So how many of you are students here at the university, or staff, faculty? How many people are somehow affiliated with the university in one form or another, just by a show of hands? Great. And the reason why I ask is because I am talking about conscientious objection. I'm actually going to exercise it myself and change the topic of my talk, because I'm going to conscientiously object to having to give a lecture on a Saturday in the middle of football season. I don't know what that's about. Actually, I'll be talking about the boundaries of conscientious objection this morning. Just to give you an idea, I have to give official disclaimer. I do work for the federal government. I'll be giving some disclosures, just some housekeeping stuff. There's a number of questions that Dr. Strabo, thank you for inviting us, by the way, and for the center. Forgive me if I butchered your name, Hassan Shanawani. I'm very sympathetic. And then we'll talk a little bit about some cases, and then some of the challenges of exercising my conscience, or perhaps for you to exercise your conscience, specifically as a medical professional. I think we've had some wonderful talks so far about the world of religious scholars and experts, the world of patients. I'm really focusing just on medical professionals right now, and specifically the moral imperatives and the normative goals of that particular community and how those are governed. We'll talk a little bit back to the cases, the questions, and if we have time, either now or during the panel discussion, we'll talk. This is not working for me. So just my official disclaimer, although I do work for the federal government, I am coming as an individual. These views that are presented are my own. They don't represent the views of the National Center for Patient Safety, the Veterans Health Administration, or the US government. Financial support, none. No conflicts of interest for me to disclose, financially or otherwise. I am going to be using mentioning, neither endorsing for or against, one non-FDA approved use of medications, specifically the use of misoprostol in the induction of labor or abortions specifically. The learning objectives today, we're going to talk about the term conscientious objection in a contemporary context, specifically focusing on healthcare, which is not the original definition of conscientious objection. We'll review at least one professional society document on conscientious objection that I participated in the development of, and parallel it to that of other societies, and consider some challenges that are inherent in the exercise, the accommodation, and potentially the exclusion of conscientious objection. Let's talk about the questions. One of the questions that Dr. Strabo was going to ask us to discuss today at the panel discussion is the right of conscientious objection limited to a way specifically to protect the provider's conscience without somehow impacting or compromising the care of the patient? Or do I have the right to protest in some civil manner or otherwise that potentially affects the patient? That is to say, that prevents the patient from getting what I believe is harm, but the patient themselves defines as a benefit. And there's a disagreement between the two of us. Okay, I have some other questions I think that before I answer that question I have to get to, and I'd like to discuss these with you today. What are the rights and responsibilities of an individual in a civil society? And I speak specifically about a liberal society. When I use liberal, I'm not talking about red state, blue state, especially here in Gainesville. It's a touchy subject, I imagine, or in Florida in general. I'm talking about liberal the way I think the Founding Fathers would define the Declaration of Independence as a liberal document, to say that we have rights and freedoms in this society. The thing that binds us all today is not some homogeneous cultural background, not some single religion. It is our shared sense of liberty, our shared sense of freedom, which is very important to me personally as a Muslim American and as a physician who serves our nation's veterans. I mean, this is something that's particularly important to me. In a society where I have private rights and I have civil rights in the public space, what defines that civil, public, shared space and the private space? Is this a public space that we're in right now, or is it a private one? We're on a state school campus. Just something to think about. Are corporations people too? I'm going to resurrect the 2012 discussion. What rights and responsibilities do corporations have in this context as we consider what they are? And what obligations and rights do groups have, if any, as they navigate and reconcile conscientious objection? Thank you so much. Some of the questions I'm not going to get to are there acceptable and unacceptable objections of conscience? I'm going to remain, for the purposes of this talk today, agnostic as to whether any particular exercise of conscience is appropriate or not. I'm not going to get into the debate of abortion, withholding of medications, or end-of-life care. That's not really a question that I feel is particularly important. I want to sort of free us from the particular discussion of that today? And can I object to the conscientious objection of another person? In other words, if someone else's exercise of conscientious objection offends me, what does that impact me, both as an individual and as a professional? Some questions, now we're really beginning to peel the onion pretty deeply here, and I'm not going to get to these questions. Let's talk about some cases. Does everyone know who Kim Davis is? So this is the Kentucky clerk who was elected in January. Several months later, the contract that she signed up with, if you will, was changed. She exercised, and she said, this is what I'm going to do as a clerk. Suddenly the law, as she understood it, changed, and she said, I'm not going to exercise my job. She was actually non-discriminatory about it, one would argue. She said, she didn't say I'm restricting my exercise of license to one group of people. She said, I'm not giving licenses to anybody, gay or straight. So and shut things down. Went to jail for 5 days, worked out a deal, and is actually going back to jail today. I don't know if you guys have been watching the news today. So, because she has overruled these deputy clerks. It's still, they're working out something right now. Does anyone know who Clarice Stanley is? One person. Let's hear it.
Flight attendant, she converted to Islam, then wanted reasonable accommodations for not serving alcohol on the plane.
Outstanding. Very good, sir. Yeah, so exactly right. Flight attendant for ExpressJet, based in my hometown of Detroit, Michigan, comes into Islam and decides that her new faith restricts her ability to perform her job, which is now a change from what she signed up. Engages into a contract with her company. ExpressJet decides to accommodate her and says, we will allow you to not serve alcohol. We're going to put that responsibility on other flight attendants on the job. One of the flight attendants complains and says, her exercise of conscientious objection offends me. She gets suspended, sues, and the dance continues. So here's another one. I cannot remember this woman's name, but she suffered, unfortunately, miscarriage and had retained products of conception. And so they had to give her a choice of either taking a medication so that she could expel the remains of the fetus that she had, or undergo a surgical procedure. She opted for the medication, specifically misoprostol. This is the non-FDA approved. Misoprostol is typically for reflux. It has a very well-established side effect that was endorsed by the WHO. It is considered an acceptable abortifacient by the WHO and other professional societies, including the American College of OBGYN. Not FDA approved for this particular thing. Why do I mention the FDA approved? One, because I am required by CME regulations to mention it, and the pharmacist says, because it's not FDA approved, I think you're having an abortion, I'm not going to give you the drug. This occurred in the state of Georgia, and that's allowed. And when they said, are you exercising your conscience? She goes, oh, no, 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 no. It's just because it's not an FDA approved indication, which I give drugs that aren't FDA approved every day of the week in my particular job. And so one of the questions was, what was the motivation of this particular exercise of overruling of the physician? No attempt, to our knowledge, was made to contact the physician and discuss this with this particular person. All three of these cases have occurred in the last 3 months. Just to give you an idea, this summer. So I'm not going back 15 years, I'm going back to Memorial Day weekend and beyond. This happened in June, okay? So this was an article about it, or excuse me, this one was a little bit earlier. Here are the state refusal laws for dispensing contraception. This occurred in Georgia, this particular one, and this follows a well-established trend since 1973, when the church law went into act after Roe v. Wade. Has nothing to do with any religious institution. Church was a Republican congressional representative, either from Illinois or Indiana. I don't remember which state off the top of my head. But basically, since then, there was about 30 states that began to allow medical professionals to exercise their right to not provide abortion services. This was specifically written for physicians. However, and now this is the current state. This is from the Society. All three of these slides are from the Society for American Progress. This is the current state. I'm not going to go through this, but suffice to say there is a fairly substantial hodgepodge of allowances where you can allow either the provider or the institution is not obligated. All of them require, to some degree or another, that you have to refer the patient to someplace else. So this is an evolving concept. It is not limited to physicians or pharmacists, nurses, respiratory therapists, anybody who is a medical professional. The next question is, what exactly is conscientious objection? Okay, so the original term of conscientious objection was established by the Mennonites during the when the Western expansion started to take on Native Americans. And basically the Mennonites said, "Thou shalt not kill." We refuse to enter into this contract with the nation that rules us, and we are going to conscientiously object to the killing of this other individual for the sake of this nation. We do not believe this is a just war, and it is contrary to our beliefs. It was specifically for this context. It has since grown. There were a number of other religious communities that began to exercise this. And finally, it became fairly substantial in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where specifically everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, including the freedom to change their religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in a community with others and in public or private to manifest their religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, or observance. This led to a Supreme Court decision in the 1960s and then in 1970 where it says you can exercise your right to not enter not enter the military. This was, of course, the result of a substantial fight between the military and this guy. Anybody not know who this guy is? He's the greatest, right? And refused to fight in Vietnam. And he exercised his conscience, and the state boxing agency board of Las Vegas, of Nevada, exercised its right to take away his title during that time. And he became a national pariah at that point in time. So conscientious objection over the years, historically, was related to military combat and was restricted specifically to a conscious clause about thou shalt not kill and thou shalt not enter. And it was religiously based, and it was against this dominant cultural imperative, this concept of the just war. We are sending off our sons to war to fight for, freedom, justice, God, the American way, all those great things. It's evolving now. It's not restricted to military combat. It is more general and broad in scope. It is not specifically to the concept of combat or killing. It is now being exercised in a variety of other contexts, specifically healthcare. It is still, I would argue, religiously based. And I wonder if it's against the dominant cultural imperative. I think certainly there are some communities that would argue that the changes in our understanding of marriage and the government's restrictions on the right to marry is becoming a dominant cultural imperative. I think there are others that would say, no, we're not there yet. Certainly if you go downstairs right now, there's some posters on the wall that say that LGBT is not a dominant cultural imperative. And I mean, that discussion is happening in this building this month. Check out those lectures. I hear they're going to be pretty good. They're downstairs in a little booth that I saw. So I think there's some controversy about this. I don't think anyone doubts the controversy, though, about refusing to fight when your nation goes to war. And that's, I think, an important difference here that has to be exercised. So now let's talk a little bit about the rights and responsibilities for individuals in a civil society. And for more about this, we actually did a talk on this a few years ago at the University of Michigan. We had a symposium where I and a good friend of mine, Dr. Asim Padella, who's now at the University of Chicago Siegel Center for Bioethics, talked about the had a symposium where religion, bioethics, and policy meet. We had a wonderful talk by Dr. Brody, who's now at UT Galveston. He was a bioethicist at the University of Michigan State. Oh, God forbid I make that mistake. So sorry. And if for all of these lectures are on YouTube, I would encourage you to look up this. And he really cites John Rawls, who, sorry, Marcia, is a famous Harvard professor, Harvard-Yale thing. And he wrote his magnum opus, I would argue, is a book in 1971, A Theory of Justice. And I would argue was possibly one of the most important pieces of liberal philosophical thought about civil society in America. And he had a couple points. I'm not going to go through the whole book, obviously. But first, each person has an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with a similar liberty for others. We all have the same rights, with some restrictions. Specifically, political liberty, freedom of speech and assembly, but he does say specifically, he uses the words liberty of conscience. He doesn't talk about liberty of entering a contract. So he doesn't talk about my rights to refuse to do business with you, nor does he talk about the right of government to restrict my ability or regulate my ability to do business with you. He specifically walked away from that twice, when he wrote this in 1971 and again in the 1990s before he died in 2002. Okay? And he talks about this concept of the public space. He really gets into this aspect of the public space, the shared space, schools, hospitals, government institutions, where we all have this common thing. And specifically, I'm not going to get into, he's one of the most sophisticated philosophers and ethicists, I would argue, but he really hit this concept of the public space. And specifically, he differentiated between this public space that we all share and all of these private spaces, whether it is my home, a place of worship, a private club, a private business, I had to put Disney because I'm in Florida, or say your country club where we didn't allow blacks, Jews, or gays to join. Okay, sometimes it was invidious. I had every right to restrict entry into my own home. I had to restrict people, if they did enter my place of worship, you had to have a bona fide belief in the same God that I believe in, et cetera, et cetera. These aren't so straightforward, the ones on the bottom. Rawls didn't get into those so much. What is but he really talked about the public space. And what did he define as the public space? He defined it as the public space. Are you getting a little nostalgic, Marcia, or are you? Right? What is it? It's the DIAC. This is the main quad of the University of Michigan. The University of Michigan is a public institution. It is considered part of the state of Michigan. It is considered a public space. And the right of free assembly. I have the right to talk about anything I want. Mr. Rawls would argue that there are certain things that you can't stop me from proselytizing, but that as a member of civil society, I shouldn't do it. That there was a social contract that I should go into, and that somehow that it's just something I shouldn't do, and that we should have this shared agreement. And specifically, and he contrasted that with this. This is for you, right? This is the cathedral of our mother, known more commonly as Notre Dame, the main cathedral at the University of Notre Dame. And this is it, the conflict between the public space and the private space. University of Michigan and Notre Dame. It doesn't get any better than this. You Gators may disagree, right? But this is it, public space versus private space, right? And he talks about this, when he talks about the public space, he talks about, I have my rights to my beliefs, you have your rights to your beliefs, but we have this concept of overlapping consensus. And we can have consensus on justice so long as we have these conceptions that lead to similar political judgments. And this was really important to Rawls. And it's really important to what we're talking about. You can believe what you want. You don't have to believe what I want. But when we enter the public space, we have to have some common grounds. Okay? And the negotiation of politics is over this civil society and what gets to be put into that. And in theory, you could have some circle over here, say white supremacists or something like that, that believe that we have to get rid of a whole group of people. But for the most part, everyone has to exist in this space. And he would argue that there is this imperative between these two groups, specifically the doctor and the patient. I would argue, and so many other critics of Mr. Rawls would argue, that it's not so straightforward. For some really simple reasons. This person is sick. She is vulnerable. She doesn't have a lot of options. This guy has every right to walk away. There is a strong, hierarchical, and many, including me, would argue, coercive relationship that goes here. This is not an engagement of equals at this point in time. And so there needs to be protections for the vulnerable. And Rawls talked about this extensively. That once we have this concept of the overlapping consensus, we have to protect the vulnerable. And who gets to be called the vulnerable, we can discuss and we can argue, but there's specifically some vulnerables. And to that end, a variety of professional societies, I am a member of the American Thoracic Society, which subscribes to the Council of Medical Specialty Societies. These are part of the contract that physicians have to have, and I'm just going to mention 4 of them. Specifically, that the physician's primary inviolate role, non-negotiable, is an active advocate for each patient's care and well-being. I must submit and place and defer my own wishes at the altar of the needs of my patients. They always trump. That's the rule. The physician's commitment to patients includes health education and continuity of care. That is to say, if I do not wish to provide you care, 1, I have to tell you what your options are, and I have to make sure that those options are available to you. Non-negotiable. Physicians should resolve conflicts of interest in a fashion that gives primacy to the patient's interests. Physicians have a responsibility to serve the healthcare needs of all members of society. I do not get to ask you what your religion is, what your background is. You belong to me, and I belong to you. It is just that simple. That is the moral imperative that I enter as a physician, and anybody who's thinking about it, know what you're signing up for, okay? And physicians have an ethical obligation, forgive my typo, to preserve and protect the trust bestowed upon them that's a society. That I have, that this is a privilege, that my ability to practice as a physician is not necessarily a right. That I am entering a social contract, and that contract can be broken, and the way it is broken is by throwing me out of the community of physicians. Heavy stuff, okay? So, in a society where I have private rights and civil rights, what defines the civic and public shared versus private space? So, you know, what happens when this is not a church, but actually it's a hospital? And what happens when I work for Starbucks and there's something that I have to do? And is this a public space? Does anyone know what this is? It's a mall. It's not just any mall. It's the Mall of America, the largest mall in the Western Hemisphere. Is this a public space? Mall of America doesn't think so. I cannot, there's no right to free assembly in this edifice. I cannot walk in there and start having rallies against pick your favorite war or conflict. They'll throw me out, and they have every right to, because it's not a public space. One might argue that they offer a public good, but, right, this is now our town square, many people would argue. But there is no right to free assembly in this particular town square, right? So that gets to another question. Are corporations people too? And what rights and responsibilities do they have in that context? And what rights and obligations do new groups have as they navigate this, right? So Mitt Romney, he said it. Corporations are people, my friend. He didn't say it on June 30th. I don't know why I put that there. And they may have more rights than we do. Is everyone familiar with the conflict with Hobby Lobby in terms of their exercise of conscience, specifically with the provision of healthcare benefits to their employees? If we believe that healthcare is a public good, if we believe that healthcare is a right, and certain things are following that, then they may say that their right to exercise their conscience is violating the right of another person. Does my right to swing my fist end where your face begins? It's not entirely clear right now. And I think this is a question that remains unanswered. So now we've got this relationship, and I would argue that now we've got to add another entity to it, which is that of this other person, that is to say the corporation, specifically the medical center. And this is not trivial. Hospitals are getting bought up around the country. The days of being an individual private practitioner are over, I would argue. I would argue that that is a good thing, and that group-based and systems-based practice governing the restrictions of physician practice is a good thing. But make no mistake, this is what's going on across the country. This is data from the American Hospital Association. Physicians are no longer becoming parts of individual groups like PHOs, IPAs, and the reason why is because physicians are now all hospital employees. They are owned by the hospital, if you will. A couple of you are nodding in the room. And hospital mergers are going up. There was a couple, it slowed down a little bit during the financial slowdown, but the numbers are going up right now. This is a map of Ascension Health, the largest not-for-profit healthcare organization. They own approximately 1,900 medical centers and are responsible for about 15 million lives. They are a Catholic health organization, and they are unequivocal about their exercise of Catholic values in the provision of healthcare. This is from their website. Okay, so back to the American Thoracic Society. We put together a statement that came out last year. There's me, there's a lot of other cool people that were on this as well. Basically, we talked about the reasons to accommodate, and specifically we were focusing on physicians. We felt that physicians had moral integrity and autonomy that we should try to protect, and that the exercise of care and that the exercise of a conscientious objection may actually result in the improvement of care. That our conscientious objection may reflect legitimate concerns about inappropriate care that's being provided to patients. Not just issues of conscience, but specifically issues of care. And we may be able to identify needed changes in professional norms and patches. However, we are some substantial reasons not to accommodate that I brought up. One more thing, by the way. The Council of Medical Specialties, the National Health Service in Great Britain, is fairly strict about this, and they fire physicians pretty liberally. for this. So they have to honor our core professional commitments, which I outlined previously. We have an obligation to protect vulnerable patients. We have to prevent excessive hardships, not only on the patients, but on our colleagues and the institution with whom we serve. That there is an accommodation that needs to be made to them as well. And we have to avoid invidious discrimination, that we cannot discriminate against a particular community of people because of specific beliefs. So there's specific recommendations. The big thing that they really say is that we should do, that they should manage this through institutional mechanisms in advance. That is to say that we should anticipate our exercise of conscientious objection and put in place a system so that we can manage these before the patient shows up. Let's not figure this out when the guy's sick. Right? As you can imagine, we have a couple critical care people. You're also in emergency medicine. The time to figure this out is not when the patient's about to die, and we have 15 minutes. This should be done in a boardroom at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when there's no patient at the bedside. That's particularly done. And healthcare institutions, HCIs, should develop and implement institutional policies that encourage prospective management of foreseeable COs and provide a clear process to manage unanticipated ones. So what happens when we didn't think of one in advance? That institutions should accommodate these if the accommodation will not impede a patient's timely access to medical services, that it will not create excessive hardships, and we don't define what is excessive, and that it is not based on invidious discrimination. A clinician's conscientious objection to providing potentially futile care, we go back to the question of providing care to a patient who's brain dead, for example, should not be considered sufficient justification to unilaterally forego treatment. That is to say, one doctor should never be allowed to make the call, that you should bring in a community of providers from the institution. And clinicians should instead use this process-based mechanism to resolve these disputes. The hospital should have in place some process of negotiations, ethics consultations, referring the physician, getting the patient to another hospital. These things should be determined in advance. And then finally, institutions should promote open moral dialogue, advance measures to minimize moral distress, and generally foster a culture that respects diverse values. And this was also echoed by the Center for American Progress with guidelines for resolving conflicts of interest, and you'll see that these are more or less the same. Always put patients' needs first in an emergency. Allow for refusal. And again, they are a liberal organization the way I defined it at the beginning, in terms of liberties and freedoms. They are a progressive left-wing organization, but they talk about it in terms of constitutional liberties. Allow for refusal with conditions in non-emergencies. Inform your employer. You have an obligation to tell them, as the flight attendant did. Alert potential patients. Let them know in advance of entering a covenant of care with you. Establish a referral plan. Have it ready so that you can hand to them. I don't provide this care, but here's a list of physicians who do. And make referrals convenient and affordable. And that's a big issue, what I'll get to in a second, that you have to fully disclose these. You should never withhold options. That is to say, if there is an option that is morally objectionable to you, you don't get to not offer that to the patient. You have to let them know about it and say, hey, here's an option for you. It's not one that I particularly participate in, but these doctors down the street might do it. Make clear when your recommendations are based on your personal values. If you have a bias, and I do this all the time, say, hey, my personal bias on this issue is this. This is what the guidelines say. Doctors disagree. Some of my colleagues would say ABC. I'm telling you XYZ. If you would like to meet a doctor that's willing to discuss ABC, let me give you his name. I can set up the appointment for you. And enforce refusal policies. So back to Kim Davis. She was in Kentucky. None of this was done in advance, completely unanticipated. The state of Kentucky didn't know what to do with it. She was held in contempt of court. That is to contrast with North Carolina, which as soon as the Supreme Court decision came down, they immediately entered a law in the books that offered county clerks the right, and approximately 5% of the state's 670 magistrates started exercising their conscience clause. This is one thing that North Carolina does better than Kentucky. I mentioned this, that North Carolina does better than Kentucky because there are other things that North Carolina does better than Kentucky as well, right? And this is a picture taken by my own children at Cameron Indoor Stadium this past April at the party celebrating our national champion Duke basketball team. You can see Coach K's right there in the team. All right, let's hear the boos. It's all right. My mom loves me. It doesn't matter. So back to Teresa Stanley. The challenge is she did all of the right things. She informed her provider. She informed her boss. She told them that the company made accommodations. The problem was that the company began, that when those accommodations were made, they didn't consider the moral objections of her colleagues, and that led to a big mess. And sometimes these accommodations are not so straightforward. So there are places in Texas where you would have to drive 1,100 miles to get an abortion in Texas. We are talking about 18 hours at a cost of $150 based on the gas prices at that point in time. Again, this is from The Atlantic. Going back to the questions, so I think we're going to talk about this question at the panel discussion, but before we get to it, I think we've gone through the rights and responsibilities of individuals in a civil society. What are my private and civil rights, and what are yours, and how do those intersect with one another? What is my relationship with organizations and corporations? How do they accommodate me? What are my obligations to accommodate them? And if we have time, we can talk about these. I think we have a little bit of time of questions. If you'd like to email me for my slides, I'm happy to provide them. Thank you.